Quorum being present, the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the first hearing of the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development for the 115th Congress. I'm honored to serve as the new chairman of this subcommittee. I want to thank Dr. Fox for choosing me for this gavel. And I want to thank my colleagues for trusting me to lead this important subcommittee. It is also my honor to welcome our new ranking member, Representative Susan Davis. I look forward to working together this Congress. I am confident we'll advance solutions that help prepare students in knowledge and skills they need to succeed in the classroom, in the workforce, and in life. Today's hearing is a part of the committee's broader effort to strengthen higher education. We all know and have seen the significant opportunities provided by post-secondary education. Unfortunately, as we also seen and realizing the dream of higher education is becoming increasingly difficult for many individuals across the country. As Chairwoman Fox pointed out at a hearing earlier this year, college costs are rising at a rapid rate. In fact, since 2006, average tuition and fees have increased by more than 40% at four-year public institutions and almost 27% at four-year private nonprofit institutions. Meanwhile, for a variety of reasons, students aren't completing their education. It is estimated that among students who started college in the fall of 2010, only 55% had earned a degree or certificate by 2016. That's not even 4 years, it's 6 years, with nothing to show for it in the end. These are just two statistics that will help illustrate the challenges individuals face when they consider whether or not they should or can pursue a higher education. They're also two of the reasons we are working to make higher education more accessible and affordable. One of the ways we can accomplish this goal is by simplifying and improving federal student aid. Over the years, the federal student aid system has become too complex. Students and their families are forced to navigate 6 different types of federal loans, 9 different repayment plans, 8 different forgiveness programs, and 32 deferment or forbearance options, each with its own rules and regulations. Sounds complicated, right? Now imagine you're a student with no background or experience in navigating such financial options and responsibilities. Faced with all these choices and decisions, some individuals don't even know where to begin. Others simply give up. We need to get rid of the complexity. We need to eliminate the confusion students face, and there are a number of ways we can do both. Just yesterday, I introduced a bill, the Empowering Students Through Enhanced Financial Counseling Act, that would improve the timing, frequency, and content of financial aid counseling. These changes to current policy would help students and their families better understand their options and responsibilities when it comes to paying for college. It's an idea that has enjoyed strong bipartisan support in the past, and I'm hopeful it will be part of the discussion as we move forward with efforts to strengthen higher education. Another idea is streamlining federal aid into one grant program, one loan program, and one work-study program. Streamlining being the operative word here. It's not about cutting. It's about cleaning things up, making it easier for individuals to explore their options and find the right school, figure out how to pay for their education, and determine the best way to repay loans. These ideas are just 2 of many solutions that have been proposed. Each makes different reforms, but they all have the same goal: make this system more efficient and more responsive to the needs of students. Simplifying federal student aid is one principle and comprehensive framework that will guide our work to strengthen higher education, but it's a critical one. Doing so will provide students and their families with a more timely and clear picture of the financial assistance they are eligible to receive. It will ensure taxpayers' dollars are supporting those students who need help the most. And perhaps most importantly, it will help more Americans realize that the dream of higher education is within reach. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and today and learning more about their ideas for simplifying and improving student aid. I know this discussion will help guide our work as we move forward to reauthorize the Higher Education Act. This hearing is especially important to me. Remember my third child, my daughter was born. I remember holding her and her brother coming into the room, and I started looking at them there together and how nice it was, baby and the young son. Then it hit me. I said, 18 years from now, they're going to be in college at the same time. Well, this is the 18th year, so I have a senior and a freshman. So this is and one at an out-of-state school and one at a private school. So higher education financing is something that's on my mind. But with that, I will now recognize Ranking Member Davis for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie, and I too look forward to a strong working relationship. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. I look forward to hearing your testimony. I'm going to come around the side here to see all of you. The Higher Education Act was enacted to expand access to college and provide an affordable degree to anyone wanting to pursue an education post-high school. And today's hearing provides us with an opportunity to hear from experts about ways to improve the federal student aid system established in this legislation. Since HEA's enactment, the United States has made substantial progress in college access. Students of color and low-income students are going to college at higher rates than ever before. And although we should celebrate these outcomes, we know that there is tremendous room for improvement. When we look at the data closely, we realize that low-income students are still accessing higher education at lower rates than their more affluent peers back in the mid-70s. This means that instead of making college less affordable by slashing billions from federal financial aid programs like the president's partial budget requests, House Democrats believe that with sufficient investment, the right targeting towards the students with the greatest need, and an easy access to financial aid, the current system could better serve America's working families. Through the HEA, the federal government has been able to provide Pell Grants, federal loans, and campus-based aid to millions of undergraduate and graduate students. But the Pell Grant program now covers the smallest share of undergraduate costs since its inception. As state disinvestment and demographic changes have driven tuition up, Congress has failed to allow the program to keep up with costs and instead has made changes to reduce eligibility in order to keep the costs down. We must strengthen Pell by increasing the maximum award, indexing the award to inflation, reinstating summer Pell, and preserve any remaining funds to reinvest in the program in future years. Otherwise, low-income students will increasingly rely on loans to afford their education. With more students taking out larger loans, we must improve the system so students have access to favorable terms and streamline income-driven repayment plans. Proposals that remove the availability of subsidized loans for undergraduate students and eliminate PLUS loans for parents to create a one-loan system would force low-income families to take out private loans, which lack the consumer protections of federal student loans. And as our country fully shifts to a knowledge-based economy, workers with graduate degrees are increasingly sought after. But throughout the years, graduate students have been excluded from the federal loan system. If we want all students to have access to high-paying jobs, Congress must preserve access to these loans as well. Congress also has a unique opportunity to strengthen the campus-based aid programs during this reauthorization. Campus-based aid allows students to work part-time to receive additional grant aid and borrow additional subsidized loans. So we should preserve and bolster these programs, not eliminate them, as is currently being proposed. Robust and targeted investments are just two pieces of the puzzle. We should make financial aid easier to access. Too many students are unaware of the financial aid options provided by the government and forego the application process, and we know that it's a bit overwhelming. And those who do apply find the form complex and confusing. Although the form has been greatly improved since its creation, we must ensure that students have a simple and functional tool at their disposal. And the recent outage of the IRS data retrieval tool used when filing the free application for federal student aid, what we know as FAFSA, has already increased the burdensome verification process. So we must work together to ensure the temporary shutdown of this tool does not negatively dissuade students from applying for aid or attending college. Mr. Chairman, we need to improve the system to work for all students, and we must create policies that pay close attention to those who have been traditionally underserved by our system. This will ensure that we can pass a strong reauthorization of HEA focused on access, on affordability, and very important, completion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the ranking member for yielding back. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I would now like to turn to introduction of our distinguished witnesses. Ms. Joellen Saucier is the Executive Director of Financial Aid for the Houston Community College System in Houston, Texas. Ms. Kristen Conlin is a founding partner for HCM Strategist, LLC, a government relations strategy and development firm. Mrs. Yolanda Copeland Morgan is Vice President of Enrollment Management with the, we got a ball game this come. I'm from Kentucky, so this coming up. The University of California, Los Angeles. We'll be playing the Wildcats this Friday night. Two great programs. And Dr. Matt Chingo is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute where he studies education-related topics at both the K-12 and post-secondary levels. I will now ask the witnesses to stand and raise your right hand. Please stand. Okay. I'll just tell you don't have to stand, but since you're standing, stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, let me briefly explain our lighting system. You each have 5 minutes to present your testimony. When you begin, the light in front of you will turn green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow. When your time has expired, the light will turn red. At that point, I will ask you to wrap up your remarks as best as you are able. Members will each have 5 minutes to ask questions. First, recognized for 5 minutes for testimony is Ms. Saucier. I practiced that. Saucier. Thank you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. I am very proud to be here. I've been a financial aid administrator for 29 years and am passionate about my work. I became a financial aid director in 1992 and have held leadership positions in various sectors of higher ed. My current institution, Houston Community College, serves approximately 40,000 aid recipients each year, of which over 30,000 receive a Pell Grant. When I entered college, I was a first-generation student from a low-income household. Without financial aid, college would not have been possible. Today, my testimony will identify some of the current complexities and resulting challenges that exist in hopes that we can move towards simplifying the entire financial aid process. The challenges can be categorized into 4 key areas: the federal application process, consumer information, student aid programs, and student loan repayment. The discussion around financial aid simplification often centers upon the number of questions on the federal application. While the number can be stunning, 83 for independent and 126 for dependent students, the advent of more advanced skip logic has assisted with shortening the time it takes to complete the online application. Still, applying for financial aid remains a barrier for many. The confusion with the process can be demonstrated by my experience at Houston Community College. Our communication plan consists of robust messages. We have over 70 different email communications sent throughout the aid delivery process. We employ 25 staff in our call center. We have a detailed phone messaging system, over 50 staff covering 14 aid offices across the city, and a communications coordinator feeding financial aid messages through various social media platforms. Regardless of these immense efforts, our students are confused and frustrated. In September of 2015, President Obama and Secretary Duncan announced that beginning on October 1st, 2016, the application would use prior income. This change results in earlier information, reduced administrative burden, and faster delivery of aid to students. This type of streamlining is needed in all areas of the financial aid process. The upcoming reauthorization provides a great opportunity to focus on improving consumer information that students and families receive. There are over 65 consumer information topics that appear in over 140 different regulations, many added in recent years. As you might imagine, administrators in my system spend hours tracking, collecting, reporting, and disclosing information. Navigating consumer information is particularly difficult for the 31% of our credit students that are first generation. These families have no experience with college, and the students truly do not understand the incredible amount of information that we provide. Not to mention, disclosures come at a time when students are completing all other steps required to enroll in college. The most important document for an aid applicant is the award letter. It informs the applicant of aid for which they may qualify. I use the word may because each program has different eligibility requirements, and based on student behavior and enrollment decisions, the student may or may not receive those funds. There are a number of grant, loan, and work programs that a student may see on an award letter, each with its own criteria and requirements. It is confusing to the student and tends to change each year, making it nearly impossible for a family to plan for the student's entire college educational costs. Obtaining student loan funding is the most complicated process of all the aid programs. The complexity makes it difficult for students to understand loan eligibility. Reauthorization is a perfect time to examine the need to retain annual and aggregate limits based on grade level, dependency status, program of study, and attendance. At Houston Community College, over 18,000 students borrow from the student aid programs each year. We need greater authority to help borrowers stay within reasonable levels of debt and require additional loan counseling based on the needs of our borrowers. Right now, schools have very little control over how much students borrow and are prohibited from requiring annual loan counseling. Reauthorization provides an opportunity to make loan repayment easier for students. Right now, there are 9 widely available repayment plans. Understandably, this creates a great deal of perplexity for borrowers. Many of our students can benefit from income-driven repayment options, but are unable to navigate the many programs to determine their best option. Houston Community College has been challenged with an 18 to 22% default rate over the past 5 years. We contracted with a third-party agency to increase outreach to students and assist them in determining the best option for repayment. Our fiscal year 2014 draft rate, which was released a couple weeks ago, came in at 11.7% as a result of these increased efforts. Since my time is limited, you will find that my full remarks provide more detail and context regarding the student challenges with financial aid. In conclusion, I have seen the complexity of the student aid process increase greatly over the past 25 years. The entire process from application to repayment has become an intricate puzzle that only a seasoned professional can navigate and understand. There are numerous opportunities for improvement, simplification, and consolidation. It is my hope that today's testimony will help you to understand the challenges that students are faced as they attempt to work through the process. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Conlin for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee for this opportunity. My name is Kristen Conlin, and I am first. I'm the first in my family to earn a college degree, the first to create jobs, start a business. I was able to graduate college in 4 years with a Pell Grant and a state financial aid without any debt. But that might not be possible for today's students. For several years, I've been part of a chorus of experts who've called for radical simplification of the federal financial aid program. 3 key reforms could improve its effectiveness and efficiency. First, streamline all federal financial aid programs into one grant program and all loan programs into one loan program. With one grant, we'd consolidate the campus aid programs into a Pell Grant that would be easier to obtain and better targeted with common sense needs analysis changes. With one loan program, we'd create one set of annual and aggregate loan limits for undergraduates and one set for graduates. We would offer uniform borrower payment benefits and one income-based repayment program. Loan eligibility would end at new, sensible credit hour limits, such as 150% of program length. With one grant, one loan, today's students can easily find how much aid they would be eligible for with a simple lookup table. Just as easily, students could get instant notification on their phones of what their federal awards would be and what monthly repayment would look like. Advocates and academics have been calling for this kind of transparency and early notification for a decade. Second, remove the barriers to on-time completion that are built into the federal loan programs. The single most effective way to make college more affordable is to reduce the amount of time it takes to earn the credential. But here, the federal government is setting a too low standard backed by its $158 billion investment. And 47 states follow, which means the simple message we send students today is you all are on track to graduate in 5 years for a bachelor's degree. Now, why is this? Policy is capping our awards at 12 credit hours, which is even more, even for students who'd like to take more. The maximum amount of the grant and loan should be pegged to students taking 15 credit hours a term or 30 credit hours a year. Students should also have access to grant aid throughout the summer. Third, I think it's important to include tax credits in your financial aid eligibility. Now, this is well beyond the jurisdiction of this committee. When this Congress considers tax reform, I encourage you to consolidate the multiple household-based post-secondary benefits into a single refundable lifelong learning tax credit. Now, these three simple recommendations are more than just student-centered, they are evidence-based. Research says that student aid works best when it's targeted, appropriately timed, clearly communicated, coordinated with other resources, and designed to provide both incentives and supports. Congress can look to states to see how simplification can make a difference for today's students. Indiana, for instance, offers larger need-based grants to students who take 30 credit hours a year or more, and requires its 21st Century Scholar students to take that true full-time course load to receive their maximum grant. And we have early encouraging results out of Indiana. Students receiving this financial aid are taking 30-plus credit hours their sophomore year at higher rates than their peers, and the improvements are particularly stronger for the two-year sector. Minnesota, it consolidates its federal and state aid, and it gives larger awards to students who take true full-time course loads. As a result, students in Minnesota, 2/3 of them, of the full-time students, they're on track to graduate in 4 years with a bachelor's degree or 2 years with an associate's degree. California's Pell Grant recipients can access a simple, generous Cal Grant. This contributes to the University of California campuses, enrolling a larger percentage of Pell Grant students than any other flagship in the country. The nation's federal financial aid system was built for another era. In 1965, when the first significant federal financial aid program began, 23% of Americans had a college degree, and that attainment level was sufficient for a vibrant middle class. That economy and those times are no more. By 2020, 65% of our jobs will require some form of post-secondary education beyond high school. A simplified federal financial aid system is part of the solution for a nation that needs many more skilled graduates, a stronger middle class, and more opportunity. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, and Ms. Copeland Morgan, you have the floor so you can get me back on the Cats versus Bruins that's coming up this weekend. No, I'm just kidding. You're recognized for 5 minutes to testify.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to appear before you today as you consider ways to strengthen federal student aid to better meet the needs of students. My name is Yolanda Copeland Morgan. I am the Vice Provost for Enrollment Management at the University of California, Los Angeles. My professional dedication to college affordability and access long preceded my time at UCLA, but I'm here today to share some of the successes we have had at the University of California and make our recommendations to improve federal student aid system. UCLA is an academically prestigious institution and has a consistently strong record of admitting, enrolling, and graduating low-income students. In fact, all of the University of California's 10 campuses are equally committed to college affordability and access. UC's core philosophy is to ensure that all eligible students can enroll at any of our campuses and to keep UC affordable. We have succeeded at this, as demonstrated through these facts. UC enrolls far more Pell Grant recipients than any other top research university in the country. In 2013-14, 40% of our undergraduates were Pell Grant recipients, compared to 22% at other comparable public universities. 42% of UC's undergraduates are the first in their family to attend college. More than half of our California undergraduates pay no tuition. But enrolling low-income students is not enough. We need to see them graduate. In this respect, UC is also succeeding. UC's Pell Grant recipients' 6-year graduation rates are nearly identical to those of their middle and upper-income peers. UC's successes is largely the result of its partnership with the federal government and the state of California, which together provide a strong network for our California students. My written statement outlines more detail, but in the short time that I have this morning, I would like to outline some of UC's recommendations to the subcommittee. My simple message is that Congress must increase its investment in federal financial aid programs, assure that federal student aid and subsidies are targeted to students with the most financial need, and improve the programs so that they are easy for students and their families to understand and access. Before I start, I want to note that President Trump's recently released budget plans for next year would cut more than $50 billion from non-defense discretionary appropriations, leading to devastating cuts in all federal education programs and essentially eliminating the opportunity for any significant increases in the federal investment in education for a long while. Congress must reject these cuts, and UC instead recommends strong, sustained, and increased funding for the Pell Grant program to increase the maximum award, continual annual inflationary adjustments for the award, restore year-round Pell Grant, and provide a Pell bonus to students who take increased credits to accelerate their time to completion. Protect and strengthen federal campus-based aid programs, which are critical tools for assisting low-income students in pursuing post-secondary educational opportunities. Simplify the student aid programs and FAFSA to increase the number of very low-income students and families who apply for and receive financial aid, but assure that federal aid remains targeted to the most financially needy students. Updating the federal student loan program is a high priority in reauthorization for UC, and we will support changes that enhance student benefits and improve how loans are administered, dispersed, serviced, and repaid. UC would strongly oppose reform proposals that eliminate in-school interest subsidies for undergraduate borrowers, limits borrowers' repayment options, or curtail graduates' incentives to engage in public service. Again, thank you for this opportunity to testify. The University of California looks forward to working with you to reauthorize Higher Education Act to expand and improve the law.
Thank you for your testimony. The ranking member just reminded me that she's an alum of UCLA, and her husband's from Kentucky.
She's not conflicted, though.
Dr. Chingo, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie. Thank you, Ranking Member Davis and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I am an education policy researcher at the Urban Institute and the co-author of Game of Loans, The Rhetoric and Reality of Student Debt. The views expressed in this testimony are my own, not those of any organization with which I am affiliated, its trustees, or its funders. The main point I want to make today is that the student loan crisis in the news is largely a distraction from the real problems facing borrowers and taxpayers. The reality is that most undergraduates borrow less than $40,000, and the average economic return to a college degree is at as high as it's ever been, despite the rise in tuition. The borrowers most likely to struggle are those who never complete a degree, many of whom have relatively small amounts of debt. Student borrowing has increased dramatically as a result of Americans getting more education, as well as federal and state policy changes. But the available evidence suggests that the typical borrower today is in a stronger financial position than she was a generation ago. And the typical monthly burden of student loan debt is largely unchanged since the early 1990s. Most households with education debt pay 4% or less of their income each month towards student loans. Yet, all is not well with student lending in the United States. In fact, there are 5 crises in student lending. First, we have a completion crisis. Only 59% of students who start at 4-year public colleges earn a bachelor's degree from any institution within 6 years. At community colleges, it's 39%. Second, we have a default crisis. Millions of borrowers are in default and tend to be those with the least debt. Third, we have a repayment crisis. Borrowers could avoid defaulting by enrolling in income-driven repayment, but existing programs are confusing and difficult to navigate. Fourth, we have an information crisis. Many students do not understand what they're getting into. Only a quarter of first-year students can accurately report how much they've borrowed. Finally, policymakers and taxpayers may soon face a cost crisis in the student lending system, especially because loan forgiveness programs may have larger costs than projected. The popular narrative of a broad-based student loan crisis is problematic because it leads to the wrong policy solutions by focusing on all borrowers, and especially borrowers with the most debt, rather than on those who most need help. For example, proposals to reduce interest rates on outstanding loans, often called refinancing, would disproportionately benefit affluent households. Instead, Congress should consolidate and simplify the federal student aid programs to make the best use of limited taxpayer dollars to help students attend and complete college. First, there should be one federal grant program. Eligibility should be determined automatically using tax records. All federal subsidies that are currently delivered through other programs, such as the subsidized loan program, should instead be delivered as upfront grants. For example, year-round Pell could be reinstated. Second, there should be one federal loan program focused on undergraduate students, not a blank check for parents or graduate students. The Parent Plus program should be eliminated, as creditworthy parents can obtain credit in the private sector. The Grad Plus program should be limited or eliminated. Graduate students attending programs with a return that justifies the cost will be able to obtain funding in the private market. Third, there should be one income-driven repayment program, which allows borrowers to make loan payments as a percentage of their income through the tax withholding system. The sole purpose of the income-driven repayment program should be to insure borrowers against the risk that they will be unable to afford their payments. Forgiveness should only be provided as a last resort, and the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program should be eliminated. Policymakers seeking to subsidize employment in certain sectors of the economy should do so directly rather than through loan forgiveness. In conclusion, student loans debt is not inherently good or bad. It enables students to make investments in their futures, but those investments do not always pay off. The key challenge facing policymakers is to reduce bad investments and the harm they cause, while resisting political pressure to further subsidize individuals who enjoy taxpayer subsidies but do not need them. The upcoming reauthorization of the Higher Education Act provides an important opportunity for Congress to ensure that the federal student aid programs do less harm and more good for students and taxpayers. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much. I thank all the witnesses for testifying. And now we'll go to panel member questions. And I will first recognize the chairman of the full committee, Ms. Fox, North Carolina. Dr. Fox, I apologize.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Chairman Guthrie. And I want to thank all of the witnesses. You've given great testimony this morning, and we appreciate your being here. Ms. Soucier, I'm aware of Houston Community College participating in Aid Like a Paycheck experiment, where students receive leftover aid incrementally instead of in a lump sum at the beginning of the year or semester. Have you seen any results from this experiment or any evidence that such a disbursement method could be useful for both students and taxpayers?
Yes, thank you. We have been participating in Aid Like a Paycheck for the last 3 years. The data is just starting to come in, but we do have internally, we have seen improvements in retention on students, not for the reasons why you might have guessed. We have a system in place right now called Return of Title IV. So when a student withdraws during a semester, we have to recalculate their aid eligibility. And a lot of times we have to return aid that they already received, causing the students to be left with a balance due, which means that as long as that balance is due, they can't come back to school, which is a problem, because many of our students stop out for personal reasons and life happens, basically. So they want to come back, but they can't until that debt is paid. And the problem is they don't have the funds to do so. So Aid Like a Paycheck, what it has done is it has spread out the disbursements over the entire semester. So we give out their disbursements every 2 weeks. So those students who have had to withdraw, they now no longer owe money because they haven't received the funds yet. So recalculating their aid is causing them to basically break even on the most part. In a lot of cases, we actually owe them a little bit of money based on the calculation, the Return of Title IV calculation. And so we have seen that students don't have that debt when they want to come back the next semester or a year later. So it has benefited students greatly in that aspect.
Thank you very much. Great insights. Dr. Chingo, thank you very much for your book. I'm going to read it this weekend. You advocate eliminating subsidized loans and instead using the dollars to provide grants that reduce the cost of college for students. Ms. Conklin's testimony also suggests a one-loan program that eliminates the distinction between the subsidized and unsubsidized loans. And Ms. Soucier's discusses the confusion and delays. Can you expand on why you suggest the elimination of the undergraduate subsidized loan and your thoughts on whether this subsidy is effective in helping the neediest students? Are there other ways we could better target limited federal funds? Actually, limited hardworking taxpayer dollars, which is what we're talking about.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Fox. The idea of eliminating the in-school interest subsidy on loans isn't to take resources away from anyone, but it's to deploy them in the way where they're most likely to impact behavior. So if we want to help low-income students complete college, I think it's better, if we're going to give them a subsidy, to give it all as an upfront grant, to reduce the price that they pay for college on day one, rather than reducing an interest rate that accrues during college. So I just think it makes the most sense to provide all of those dollars as upfront grants, rather than burying them in a subsidy that students may not really understand.
Thank you very much. Ms. Conklin, you bring up an important point about what constitutes full-time enrollment. As you point out, 12 hours is now considered full-time by the federal government. But it's a message to students because only 55% of them are graduating within 6 years. I'm intrigued by the state results that states have seen when setting the expectation for on-time completion. Would you want to say a little bit more about what this does about college affordability, and can you explain the relationship between enrollment intensity and the odds of completion?
Dr. Fox, thanks for that question. I'll probably run out of time and submit a full answer for the written record. Simpler tells our students the truth they need to hear. The best way you're going to save money, as much as 50% on your education, is to finish on time. When we give these realistic expectations to students, as we see in Indiana, we not only tell students what they need to do, we tell colleges. In Indiana, they've started opening up their summer residence halls at a discount or for free. We see reduced tuition. We see changes in guidance. And that is why we see the improvements across the board in both 2-year and 4-year sectors.
I think maybe you'll be able to cover that in further time, but the chairwoman's time's
Thank
expired.
you very much.
I'd like to appreciate your answer. We'll get to that, I'm sure, as we move forward. I recognize the ranking member, Ms. Davis, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to direct my first question to Ms. Yolanda Copeland Morgan. The president's budget would make significant cuts, as we know, to campus-based aid programs and would deprive millions of students of much-needed aid. How would the elimination of these programs or reduction in funds impact the students on your campus and across California? And can you be as specific as possible?
Yes, so, and let me just state for the record, I'm a first-generation college student and benefited from all of these programs. And as a result of that, the federal government made less investments in my children, which is exactly what we're trying to do here. First of all, these programs are critical to not only access, but to retention of these students. The idea that we would have one loan and one grant sounds simple enough. But in fact, life is complex and being a student is complex. Our responsibility as financial aid officers are to ensure that students have mentors there who can help them fill the gap, and that's what campus-based aid does. Without campus-based aid, the federal Perkins Loan Program, work-study program, and SEOG program, we would not have the tools that are necessary to target the most neediest students. And that's what really allows us not only to provide access to these students, but to graduate them. So we're advocating, and I've past chairman of the college board in this position, served in our national association, and for decades we've been saying, especially because of the loss in the federal Pell Grant program, the loss of purchasing power there, that we're advocating that we retain these programs. They work. We certainly believe that there are more improvements that can be made, but the current continuous investment in campus-based program, increasing the maximum Pell Grant amount, and continued federal investment in these programs are key given the demographics of our society today.
If we were somehow able to keep the amount the same, and then that's the difficulty with trying to simplify, is that we lose generally whenever we try and consolidate. That seems to happen. Would there be a reduction in complexity if in fact that could be done at some levels, and why do you think that's not likely to happen?
I doubt it, because the financial aid program, financial aid comes from state sources and institutional sources, which all have different forms. But right now, the current FAFSA allows many states to eliminate having their own application. So eliminating or simplifying, oversimplifying the FAFSA form would simply result to where we were decades ago, where every time the student wanted to apply for state aid or institutional aid, they had to fill out a separate application because the federal needs analysis did not meet the needs of the states or institutions who are interested in making sure that their financial aid is targeted to the most needy students. I think of this sort of as the IRS process. We do not allow all citizens to fill out a 1040A. The IRS process is complicated, overly complicated, but the idea is that we want to be able to distinguish our low-income students from middle-income students from those families who have the ability to pay. So I do believe that going back, oversimplifying the FAFSA form will result in a more complex process for our students.
Thank you. Ms. Saucier, I wonder if you could speak for a second. I know in your written testimony, you spoke about the fact that many students on campus are subject to FAFSA verification. And you mentioned out of 80,000 aid applicants, 38,000 were selected for verification. And you also indicated that low-income students who may have a harder time providing the required documents are more likely to be forced out through the verification process because they're not able to complete that. Could you speak to us a little bit about that, and how do we deal with that?
Sure, I'd be
What
happy
happens to
to.
the students?
In our, what I call my backroom operation, I have 18 people, all they do is verification day in and day out. There are a multitude of different types of students that attend Houston Community College. You know, we're a melting pot. Our city has people from all over with all different circumstances. So we deal with a lot of unusual situations, especially with the tax law. We deal with a number of students who were unable to fill out their taxes correctly, and we have to look at that information when we're doing verification. So basically what's happening is the forms themselves are taking time for students to complete.
Maybe we can get to those as we move forward.
I'd be happy to give you more details on that.
Thank you.
I'd like to continue. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. So, Ms. Saucier, the statistics Dr. Chingo's highlighted in his written testimony were stunning. According to a study by the Brookings Institute, which Dr. Chingo's co-authored, only a quarter of first-year students could accurately report how much they had borrowed, and 14% of the students who had borrowed money thought they had no debt at all. This information problem is very concerning to me, and it's why I introduced the bill I mentioned earlier that would require improved federal aid counseling for aid recipients throughout their education. Are you noticing trends Dr. Chingo's discussed in his testimony on your campus? And can you discuss the benefits to students of being able to counsel them about their financial aid?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we have 6 financial coaches on staff at our institution. Those coaches work very closely with students that are willing to come to our counseling sessions and are willing to come to our workshops that talk about debt and student loan repayment options. However, we can't require it. So we're prohibited from requiring them to come before we can deliver the funding to them. So it's difficult to get students to want to come to these sessions and learn about student aid and student loan debt. If we had the ability to require them to even do an online process, put together some online videos and watch what it means to have a student loan and repay those student loans, I think that would benefit them greatly. Our students are defaulting on the loans because they don't understand it. They don't understand they even took out a loan. All they're doing is signing a piece of paper electronically online. They're accepting a loan. They're going in and doing a quick and easy online promissory note, and they're not reading the fine print, and they don't understand what they're getting into until they graduate and walk away.
I'd like to move to Ms. Conklin now. Thank you for your answer. Ms. Conklin, I noticed that HCM proposal eliminates current deferment and forbearance options, which allow borrowers to suspend payments during times of economic hardship. Can you explain how the technical panel arrived at the conclusion the elimination was better for borrowers? And can you discuss the impact such a proposal would have on borrowers struggling to make their payments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what he's referring to is a technical panel I led back in 2012 with a bipartisan group of academics, financial aid experts. And what we recommended was the single loan program is a income-based loan repayment program. And so basically, a family would have the ability to take up to 300% of their family income and deduct, 300% of family income would be deducted from their available, income, and then they can have a decision to pay up to 15% of that. So that actually being able to adjust your payments based on your income is the relief that you would need in repayment. Again, you take the lower of the two payments. And so it's putting everybody into that default loan repayment that itself is the borrower benefit.
Yeah, thank you. And now for Dr. Chingos, the topic of the Bennett hypothesis, which suggests that increases in available federal student aid corresponds with increased tuition prices, often comes up as we discuss the aid programs provided by the federal government. The last thing we want to do as federal policymakers is make higher education more expensive. Can you discuss your thoughts on the hypothesis and what we should consider as we reauthorize the Higher Education Act?
Sure. I think the Bennett hypothesis has a lot of intuitive appeal, right? You make more money available for something, enables institutions in the long run, at least makes it easier for them to raise their prices. Now, the evidence on it is somewhat mixed. I think federal policymakers ought to be most concerned about situations where the federal funding footprint is the largest. So cases like with graduate loans, where graduate students can borrow up to the total cost of attendance, no questions asked, I think we ought to be concerned there. I think we ought to be concerned at institutions where federal grants and loans make up a very large share of student aid. Thank you.
Thank you. And those concludes my questions. I'll now recognize Ms. Adams. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'll recognize Mr. Espiat for 5 minutes for questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Dr. Chingos, you have mentioned that you advocate for the elimination of loan forgiveness programs. And loan forgiveness programs have, for many years, since at least 2007 for sure, have been a part and parcel of a mechanism to bring professional help in public service to the stress areas across the nation. For example, school districts have shown for many years to lack academic achievement levels that we could all be proud of, have used forgiveness loans to attract very qualified teachers to come to those school districts and try to pull them by their bootstraps. Communities that don't have the adequate health care often resort to loan forgiveness programs to bring in doctors or nurses that will help them become healthy again. So this is a very important program, not only for those that will benefit from the loan forgiveness, but for communities across the country that are facing dramatic challenges. Why adopt this heavy-handed approach to sort of like eliminate loan forgiveness programs when in fact these are essential and basic to many neighborhoods throughout the country, and particularly those neighborhoods that are facing great challenges in education, healthcare, and other arenas where we can bring the best professionals that we have available. In some cases, we have had to go abroad to bring qualified teachers to our school districts, and we have had to go abroad to bring medical professionals to our neighborhoods. Why be punitive and say, you're not going to be rewarded for coming into these very distressed neighborhoods that require the public service that you're able to provide?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. My view is that loan forgiveness is a very blunt instrument for attacking those extremely important problems that you identified. And the problem is that loan forgiveness, particularly the public service loan forgiveness program, delivers what amount to taxpayer subsidies in a very arbitrary manner. So it's true that those high needs areas you identified could potentially benefit, but roughly 1/4 of the economy is defined as public service under the law. So the amount of benefit someone gets relates to sometimes an arbitrary distinction between whether their organization qualifies or not. So doctors in nonprofit hospitals get it, but not doctors in for-profit hospitals, even though they may be doing similar work. And the amount of benefit you get relates to not just the importance of the work you're doing, but how much you borrowed for school. So you could have two people working in the same nonprofit. One of them worked their way through a public college, didn't take on a whole lot of debt, and the other person went and borrowed as much as they could to get an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree somewhere. And that second person would get a whole lot larger subsidy. So I think that there's just much better targeted ways of helping people and as I said in my testimony, subsidizing people in certain sectors of the economy than forgiveness.
But getting into the minutia of things sometimes you could lose the forest for the trees. Let me give you an example. Bilingual teachers, certified bilingual teachers, which are essential to many neighborhoods, many districts, many states across the country, where we want to bring recent arrival English language learners up to par with everybody else, are lacking. And as a result, we have to go to Spain, Chile, all over the planet to get these certified teachers to come in, or bilingual teachers to come into our district. Why not create an incentive in our higher education system to have the best that are local here to come to those district health areas? Many districts that lack primary care physicians, emergency room physicians. We have to go abroad to get doctors. By the way, some of them may not be able to come in through because of the Muslim ban now, but we have to go abroad to get these doctors. Why not create an incentive here locally for our U.S. students to come into these districts and provide that help and then get access to these loan forgiveness programs? What is wrong with that?
My view is that those incentives should be provided directly by either tax credits to those people or just ways to increase their salaries, and not through loan forgiveness programs that also have to give away money to a bunch of other people that are aren't as important.
I think tax credit programs are often backdoor mechanisms that are now always used by the recipient. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield my remaining time.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Stefanik for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony on this very important issue today. I also was the first member of my immediate family to graduate from college, so making higher education more affordable and more accessible is one of my top priorities. I've worked closely with schools in my district, in New York's 21st Congressional District, to address the challenges of affordability. And these conversations, particularly with community colleges, have laid out what can be accomplished if we modernize the federal Pell Grant program. So my first question is for Ms. Saucier. You and other witnesses today have mentioned year-round Pell Grants as a way to help students complete their education more quickly. You also mentioned the implementation difficulties of the old year-round Pell Grant program. Earlier this month, I reintroduced the bipartisan Flexible Pell Grants for the 21st Century Students Act, which reinstates year-round Pell Grants, but my bill also addresses implementation concerns by specifying that institutions can decide which award year to assign the payment toward for payments spanning two award years. Would this address some of the implementation concerns you mentioned, and can you expand on how you believe year-round Pell would benefit students?
Well, I think year-round Pell was a success once we implemented the complexity of it. It took us a couple of years to get our systems to understand how to treat students under that new framework. But once we did it, we started seeing the benefit of it. I personally did my bachelor's degree in 2.5 years, and I know how much money that saved me. I didn't have year-round Pell back then. I just had the straight Pell and lots of student loans. But I know that it is a tremendous saving of time and money to enable students to go year-round. And it's also a retention tool, because keeping the student engaged over the summer is a big deal. We lose a lot of students, especially at the university level, during the summer as things start to happen in their life. Keeping them engaged during the summer is a huge benefit to the student and the school, and improves completion rates. So I do know for a fact that year-round Pell benefited students, and we were actually unhappy to see it go away when it did.
Yes, and thank you for adding in the importance of college completion, because as we grapple with the student loan crisis, raising that completion rate is a critical piece to the puzzle. My next question, which is on the same issue, is for Ms. Conlin. In your testimony, you discuss how year-round assistance and increased flexibility would help improve access for non-traditional students. Can you expand upon how increased flexibility in the disbursement of federal Pell would assist a student, for example, who is slightly older, is working part-time, is a parent?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your focus on what we call today's students in the business. Most of our students today are what used to be non-traditional, and they, in fact, do have to juggle work and children in order to earn their credential. And so what we're seeing more and more in American higher education is real innovation in delivery, where people are able to do self-paced learning. We're able to put remedial courses in the middle of credit-bearing courses and give students additional support so they get out of remedial education quickly. All of those innovations require flexibility around the disbursement of money. Some of our most successful programs for non-traditional students, I think about CUNY ASAP, which is being replicated in other places like Ohio. That's a set of guided pathways for non-traditional students. It costs more in those first 2 years to be able to educate them. But at the end, it's a lower cost per degree for taxpayers and for students. And so what we need to be able to do is front load some of that Pell money for those early years to be able to fund that innovative program, which has very good results.
Thank you very much, and I just want to take a moment to thank the committee for their support and thank my colleagues who have signed on as co-sponsors. This is a bipartisan bill, and for any of my colleagues who are not co-sponsors, I want to encourage you to look at the Flexible Pell Grants for 21st Century Students Act. This is modernizing Pell. It is bipartisan, and I'm hopeful we can get this passed in this Congress. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you for yielding. Now recognize Ms. Adams, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Davis, for hosting this hearing. And to those of you who are here testifying, we thank you very much as well. Ensuring that students have greater access to an affordable higher education is critical to addressing our nation's skill gap and preparing Americans for the jobs and the economy of the 21st century. I will just add to the comments that have been made that I, too, was a first-generation college student. Last year's Republican platform called for a stop to the direct loan program and a return to a system similar to the federal family education loan program, where private lenders originated federally guaranteed loans. Conservative think tanks, however, have argued that going back to this type of system would only increase costs to taxpayers. Therefore, more recent proposals have now focused on scaling back or eliminating federal lending for two groups. The authors of these proposals argue that because these two groups of individuals have a credit history, the private market can serve them just as well as the federal government, if not better. My question, Mrs. Copeland Morgan, I want to focus on Parent Plus loans and would like to know if eliminating Parent Plus loans would be detrimental to students, in your opinion, and if so, why?
Indeed, it would be detrimental to the student and to the families. The fact is, not all families can get access to private loans. Secondly, there are predatory practices out there in the private loan area, an area that since going to direct loan, we've spent less time counseling parents and students on. And also, plus loans allow families who have not had the ability to save for college to contribute to their children's education. And I think that's a fact that is overlooked. The private loan market simply did not serve our most neediest families well, nor did it serve those families, working middle-income families well at all. So I would certainly remind us to look at some of the challenges that we were dealing with before direct loan.
Thank you for that response. As you mentioned, eliminating Parent Plus loans would be detrimental to a number of students, particularly students at HBCUs and low-income students seeking graduate degrees. I have a letter, Mr. Chair, from Dr. Michael Lomax, President and CEO of UNCF, which supports college success for minority students, outlining the need to provide federal investments in Pell Grants, including restoring year-round Pels, increasing the maximum award, and so forth. And I'd like to submit this for the record.
Objection so ordered.
Thank you. Now, but knowing that the president's budget blueprint raised nearly $4 billion from Pell, this letter is even more important, so thank you for receiving it. Mrs. Copeland Morgan, the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act affords Congress with an opportunity to simplify the financial aid system, specifically FAFSA. And research has shown that this form presents barriers for low-income and first-generation students. In fact, about $24 billion go unclaimed each year, including a $2.7 billion of Pell Grant funding. Although the form has been simplified throughout the last 2 decades, I believe that more can be done. But I also know that simplification comes with trade-offs. Making it too simple means that aid will be less targeted, and states and institutions, many of which rely on information found on the FAFSA to determine state and institutional aid, may no longer have sufficient information to make accurate awards. So do you agree that these are valid concerns, and if so, what considerations should be mindful as we work to simplify FAFSA?
I do agree that oversimplification is a valid concern. I think there are improvements that can be made, for example, taking advantage of the federal government's vast database around other need-based programs and simplifying the process for low-income students who have already been verified through other federal needs-tested program is one way of simplifying that. I think that also, if we go back to an I want to reemphasize this, back to an oversimplified federal form, it will complicate the process for low-income students. We've been here before where every state had its own form, every institution had their own form because the needs analysis from the federal government was not sufficient. The other alternative is to have students use documents like the College Board's profile form, which is a fee-based form, which would be another barrier to low-income students applying.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
I'm out of time, Mr. Chair. You're back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Allen, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for being with us today. Mr. Gingas, the current, your statistics point that students are actually entering higher education, and obviously the result is that they do not really know exactly why they're there, or they would probably complete that education. In other words, you ought to begin with the end in mind, meaning that there should be a career path. I mean, that's the reason you get an education, is to get a good job. And everywhere I go in the school systems, you know, I ask these students, I said, why are you getting an education? And a lot of them don't know why they're doing that. So in your testimony, you state that there are 5 real loan crises, and none of them involve the $1.3 trillion in loan debt number that we commonly cite. Why is it, do you think this is the case, and how can we turn the narrative around to focus on solutions to these very high education challenges facing students and borrowers?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think the way that the narrative around student loan debt has evolved to focus so much on that $1.3 trillion number has as much to do with who's borrowing as how much they're borrowing. And how things have shifted over the last couple of decades is that in earlier years, federal student loans were a targeted program. They were means tested through almost their entire history until the 1992 reauthorization of HEA. So the folks who borrowed tend to be lower and middle income people. Now, it evolved to a point where high-income students are borrowing a lot. They're especially borrowing a lot to go to graduate school. And now the top fifth of the income distribution holds something like 40% of the outstanding student loan debt. So I think what you're seeing is, relatively affluent, politically more vocal groups of people trying to represent their interests, which focus on the $1.3 trillion, getting forgiveness for large graduate loans, getting reductions in their interest rate, when the real problems are among folks who are struggling with small amounts of debt. Low-income single moms who got a couple credits at a for-profit college, no degree show for it, just a couple $1,000s in debt. Those are the people we should be worried about, even though they're not always the people who get heard the loudest.
You suggest that the current federal student loan aid program is doing harm to students. Where do you see this the most, with the low-income population that's borrowing substantial sums of money to get an education? Where do you see the most damage here?
Well, the real trade-off we face here is between wanting to provide access to everyone and wanting people to make good investments that'll pay off for themselves, because it's their time and money too, and for taxpayers. So I'm very sympathetic to the need to provide as broad access as possible, but at the same time, there are lots of students going to programs with very poor track records of success, very high default rates. So I think in the next reauthorization of HEA, it's worth taking a hard look at what programs are eligible for students to use federal dollars to go to them, and how do we hold them accountable while still providing access to students.
Good. Ms. Conklin, as you're aware, the Federal Work-Study Program receives its funding through a complicated two-part formula. Can you discuss whether you believe the current funding structure is appropriately targeting aid to needy students, and why this matters for the program's effectiveness?
Thank you, Chairman. It's a good question, and I think it's important to note that that technical panel whose recommendations I represented today did call for consolidating work study into a Pell Grant program. But I can see a path that looks like what the chairman described: one grant, one loan, one work study. But that work study would need to be reformed. Right now, we have, again, the work study distribution is built on an old system. Not all institutions are eligible for it. We see a skewing of dollars. It doesn't look like need. 10% of work study families make more than $100,000 a year. Only 5% of public four-year students are getting work study. Columbia University, for instance, it's one of those institutions first into the program. They're getting 3 times more money than Florida State, who has 4 times more students and many more Pell students. So again, simpler targets our federal dollars on the neediest students and the broad group of open access institutions that support them. So if we keep work study, let's upgrade it for today.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. And I was at my daughter's parents' weekend at my daughter's college in Chicagoland the weekend before the election. The best political ad I saw all season was this guy came on. I watched it. I said, I'm really going to like this guy. I hope I never have to pronounce his name, because the political ad was about dealing with his name. But I'm going to do it, and I appreciate it. It was a great ad. And it's my good friend from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamoorthi. You're recognized for 5 minutes for questions. That was a good ad.
Thank you, Congressman. Just call me Raja. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here to be able to ask questions of you folks. I was able to attend college, based on financial aid and loans and scholarships. Making post-secondary education more affordable and accessible is one of my top priorities, and I believe that financial aid should be enhanced if the cost of college is indeed a severe impediment to accessing post-secondary education. But I have a couple quick questions that I want to ask of you, Dr. Chingos. My constituents are telling me that colleges are spending a lot of money on fancy dining halls and rock climbing walls or unnecessary administration. How can we nudge these schools and institutions to lower the cost of college, which will give greater purchasing power to enhance Pell Grants and other student aid?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I've heard those concerns as well. I think they do apply to a particular part of the higher education market. I don't think at community colleges we're seeing lazy rivers and climbing walls, so I think it is important to bear that in mind. But at the same time, I think we ought to be concerned about rising college costs. So I think that there are, as Congress thinks about reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, you have to go back and worry about this Bennett hypothesis that the chairman recognized. Are these programs making it too easy for colleges to raise their prices and spend money on things that students want? The problem is that to push back against that, you need to have the federal government getting involved in trying to create incentives for how institutions spend their money. So there's sort of a question over the federal role there and the right way to balance those incentives with the need to provide these important financial aid programs to students that you mentioned. So there's a tension there, I guess is what I'm saying.
There's a tension, but I don't want to burn up increased aid on increased tuition costs. That's my biggest concern, really, which is that I'm all in favor of increasing Pell Grants because I do believe they serve a very important role in allowing needy students to access higher education. But at the same time, I'm just concerned about the galloping costs of higher education. I mean, people in my district are really unable to save and afford college for their kids because it's just getting so far out of reach. So I'm trying to figure out, what carrots and sticks the federal government can offer to make sure that, costs of college don't rise at the same time that we're increasing federal aid. Ms. Conlin, I want to follow up what I just said with this statistic. In 2015, researchers from the Federal Bank of New York and Brigham Young University released a paper suggesting that schools raised tuition by 55 cents for each $1 increase in Pell Grants their undergraduates received, and by 60 to 70 cents for each extra dollar of subsidized student loans. That's very concerning to me because, again, I want to enhance financial aid, and I want to make sure that our students have the tools to access post-secondary education, but I don't want it to be burned up in just increasing tuition costs. So can you comment on this, please?
Thank you for the question and for your interest in the representation of Americans' concern about affordability. It's a top 2-3 concern among Americans. What you have is the same concern that state policymakers have. And what state policymakers have is many of them have tuition setting authority. And so we see in those states with tuition setting authority, when they put caps or bans that look like increases in family income, that we see lower rates of tuition increases. That's not something that the federal government can do. At the federal government level, again, we're talking about getting rid of the Grad Plus loan program with no loan limits at all, and what that does to price and sensitivity in the market. We're talking about sensible loan limit lengths about 150% of the time. Again, that puts some limits. But then we also talk about, what's the relationship? We did see in states that with the increase in the Pell Grant program, the rapid increase in the Pell Grant program between 2008 and 13, that a number of states increased community college tuition. And so you see like in Alabama, where you'd had about $27 a year increase between 2004 and 28 to their community college tuition. But come 2008, when we started to put more money into Pell, community college tuition was going up $280 a year. A lot of that is related to what the state was doing, and the states face Medicaid pressures and other funding priorities. But all in all, what you see is this spiraling tuition that if you saw the CNBC report this weekend, they said that if you're born today, 18 years later, it could cost $500,000 to go to college. So there's a collective shared responsibility between federal government, states, and institutions to really not just keep tuition at the rate of family income, but actually try and find ways to cut tuition and cut time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Members' time has expired.
Thank you.
Yes, they've thrown a substitute in here, and
You suddenly look different.
surprised. I
Mr.
know.
Guthrie.
I know. But
Thank you.
second verse, same as the first. And believe it or not, I recognize myself for 5 minutes as well. Dr. Chingo, let me talk with you a little bit about exactly your concern, which is the information crisis. But I believe the information crisis goes deeper than just whether students know they have a loan or not. I think, and I agree, don't leave Mr. Krishnamoorthi, I'm going to agree with you. We do have a crisis on our hands one of information needed by students to make a wise decision, students and families on a return on investment. Far too frequently, students going to college, and like the tradition here, I was the first in my family to even see a college, my extended family, never mind graduate from college. You have to guess at whether or not you're likely to succeed. You have to guess at whether or not you're likely to get a job, because you can't get that information from most colleges and universities. That information isn't there. And that lack of information doesn't allow the consumer to make valid choice. Dr. Chingos, how do we get to a point where consumers are aware of the likely cost of attending college will be and what their likelihood of success? How do we get that information so they know that when they decide to become an architect at the University of Michigan, for example?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a really important point that this information crisis extends well beyond that one statistic I mentioned. So on the front end, because the aid process is so confusing and hard to navigate, people don't know how much aid they're getting from the federal government until they've applied to college, filled out a FAFSA, and gotten aid offers. So I think simplification, I've called for not simplifying the FAFSA, get rid of it entirely. Base people's aid awards on the average family income when they were growing up, say from age 10 to 16, put that money in an account and tell them at age 16, no forms, no prior year, here's how much you're eligible for. So I think we can fix it on that side. But you're right, we also need better information on the other end. How much can I expect to make? And will I be able to repay my loan if I go to a particular college or program of study? And I think the Obama administration made important advances there with the college scorecard, providing information at the institution level. I think we can go a step further, as many states have, provide that information at the level of program of study with data that already exist and can continue to be approached.
Let me suggest that I spent 35 years, my entire professional career, in workforce development and post-secondary education. And we reported every year completion rates by program, by location, the employment by program, by location, the wage they made by program, by location, for 19 campuses. Yeah, you cannot find that information out in most public universities and colleges for a program. You can get aggregate information. So I guess, Mrs. Copeland-Morgan, how do we get universities to understand that information is critically needed by consumers to make wise decisions so they can be in control, frankly, rather than let administrators and a federal bureaucracy be in control?
Thank you for your question. Many universities do surveys. The response rates are not necessarily where they need to be, but I think that we can certainly incentivize institutions to get that information. It is in our best interest to make sure that students understand what the labor market will be for them once they're pursuing those majors. And I would go back to the front end in terms of simplification. We often think of that as being a form, but I agree that there are, and some of the work by Susan Donarski shows this, that early notification of eligibility for financial aid is key, not only to access, but in terms of the retention of those students. And there is a lot of research that shows there's intergenerational transfer of poverty. And so the idea of doing a needs test via the FAFSA or other methods each year also complicates the process. And so I certainly have found in almost 40 years of being an aid administrator that for my low-income students, they don't suddenly get rich the next year. So another area of simplification is not just the front end, but in terms of helping those students to stay in our institutions and graduate, incentivize the institutions.
Let's talk about graduation rates for a moment, because I think the data that Dr. Chingo's put forward, and we're running out of time here, is critically important. The average completion rate for a community college is 39%. Now, as I said, I led a group of private career schools, and the accreditation standard was 70%, or you no longer were able to be a viable institution. How is it that, yet you talk to students when they go to community college about the likelihood of succeeding, they don't have that information, along with how much they borrowed and all those kind of. That lack of information, I think we're all responsible for making sure is communicated effectively to students what the likelihood of success here and how we help them succeed, but they need to know to make that investment. They're borrowing money right now on a guess that they can succeed and move their career forward on a hope and a prayer because they don't have information. And we are all responsible in this room for making sure that we have better information. That puts them in control rather than institutions, rather than bureaucrats. And my objective on this committee is, in fact, to focus on that. And my time is up, and I'll recognize the next member. Thank you. Mr. Polis, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to begin by thanking our chair and ranking member for holding the hearing. And frankly, the timing of the hearing is excellent. It was only last week when President Trump and Secretary DeVos put an end to a prohibition on certain fees on student loans. After being in office only a few weeks, President Trump and Secretary DeVos have actually increased the cost to student loan borrowers. So clearly, any progress on this area will have to be made by Congress, which is why I'm excited that we're having today's hearing. I also want to point out that, of course, we all agree that there's ways to make financial aid simpler for students and families. I think we can do that together. I was encouraged to hear Chairman Guthrie say that simplifying financial aid does not mean cutting it, because unfortunately, the one grant and one loan proposals we've seen also happen to reduce the overall federal investment in financial aid. So again, those two are not mutually exclusive, but so far the proposals we've seen, like the President's proposal to eliminate the supplemental educational opportunity grants, don't all suggest that that money is reinvested in actually helping to make college affordable. The truth is that I hear across my district, as so many other representatives do, that students and families have already a hard enough time paying for college. Cutting the amount of financial aid isn't going to make it easier to attend college. My first question is for Yolanda Copeland Morgan about income-driven repayment plans, which I feel are essential for borrowers who aren't able to afford monthly payments under a standard repayment plan. Right now, there's an excessive amount of income-driven repayment plan options, and that often leaves borrowers confused or not enrolled about what might be best with their own budgets. How can we simplify repayment plans while ensuring borrowers have generous terms? And can you talk about the different protections provided by income-driven repayment plans?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I would really encourage the committee to think about income repayment plans being the default repayment plan for students. As you've heard, many of the students who are in default have very small amounts of loans. The requirement that students have to verify their income every year is burdensome. Students forget about it. And again, when you look at the intergenerational transfer of poverty, or for many of our students who go into service areas, working as teachers and other professions of service, I think we could use the IRS data and other kinds of data that's accessible to the federal government to prevent some of those defaults.
And it sounds like what you're recommending is either a universality of income-based repayment or an opt-out of income-based repayment. Ms. Soucier, do you agree with that statement?
Absolutely.
I also want to ask about flexibility for Pell dollars. In my district, we have Colorado State University, Fort Collins, which saw the number of Pell-eligible students enrolling in summer programs double when we were able to use Pell dollars over summer term. Unfortunately, that flexibility no longer exists, and students that depend on Pell dollars only use them in the fall and spring semester, therefore increasing the time it takes for them to reach graduation. And almost every time I meet with students in my district, our universities like CSU and CU, our community colleges like Front Range Community College or Colorado Mountain College, one of the first things I hear is restore year-round Pell. I know many of us are optimistic that we could use some of the additional dollars in the Pell Reserve towards improvements to the Pell program like year-round Pell. And I was hoping that, Ms. Copeland Morgan, you could speak to the benefits of year-round Pell.
Thank you again. I think year-round Pell is one of the most positive things we've done in the financial aid program. It allows students to accelerate their time to degree. Oftentimes, students are staying in an additional full year when they could graduate in the summer by taking 1 or 2 courses that they need. I was one of those students who spent a 4th year of financial aid when I only needed 6 units. I would really encourage the committee to look at the maximum Pell Award, increase the maximum so that it does allow a student to take full advantage of the opportunity to go for summer, and I think that would be a good use of the surplus that we see in the Pell program at this time.
And last Congress, I joined a number of colleagues introducing legislation allowing students to use prior year tax data when completing FAFSA. And the Obama administration made that change, but we're now in a period of time where the Trump administration seems to be undoing a lot of things that the Obama administration does. So I think we should have more concern with ever to simply put that change in statute rather than leave it up to the whim of the administration. Just as an example, in Colorado, FAFSA completion rates increased substantially this fall after students were able to fill out the FAFSA earlier. I just want to end, since my time is up, by encouraging this committee to, I think, put a largely non-controversial step in statute to prevent it from being at the whim of a secretary or president. It is a common sense measure that makes it easier to fill out that form and apply for student aid and find out what you're getting. And I'm happy to yield back.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. I now recognize Mr. Lewis for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. As a parent who annually fills out the FAFSA forms, I can tell you this is a much-needed hearing, and I appreciate everybody attending today. Let me start at 30,000 feet here with Mr. Chingos for a moment. One of the oldest rules in economics or the insurance industry or anything in regard to finances is a third-party payment rule or the moral hazard. When we see third parties come in, and frankly, we're debating this in healthcare right now, but it could be any particular commodity. It's certainly true in higher education. When we see third parties come in and assume the costs, what we see in many cases are inflated costs. So if tomorrow, all of a sudden, somebody said, gosh, for every cup of Starbucks you buy, the federal government's going to issue you a Starbucks grant, and it's going to cover $3 of the cost of a pound of coffee or whatever. I'll take the bet that the pound of coffee price is going to go up. And it's going to go up because the providers know there's a subsidy. We have seen a massive increase in tuition at four-year liberal arts schools and for-profit schools across the board. We've seen an increase. The big picture for me is, how do we provide the need that is there without inducing this moral hazard? The cost of attending a four-year public institution has increased by more than 40% in just a decade. The only thing rising faster than tuition are textbooks. So we've got a situation here where everybody's talking about, oh gosh, we've got to make it easier for folks to borrow. We've got to decrease the cost of borrowing. We have to make more student loans, more Pell Grants. Pell Grants alone have skyrocketed. I don't have the figure right in front of me here, but to what, $30 billion? We are inducing the moral hazard here. So how do we provide a program, Mr. Chingos, that A, provides what we want for access, but B, doesn't induce this moral hazard?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you accomplish that goal by having programs that are targeted and narrowly tailored to particular federal interests, such as helping low-income students go to college. So to go back to your Starbucks example, if only 1 in 10 customers got that Starbucks grant, it's going to be harder for Starbucks to raise the price because 9 out of 10 customers coming in the door, they don't know they have that grant. But if we give everyone, enough of a grant to get up to the most expensive cup of coffee you can get, then you have to be more concerned about that. So I think by being targeted, by focusing on students who've been historically underserved, you accomplish both the goals of helping them and of limiting the moral hazard problem that you highlight.
Has the tripling of Pell Grants from $13 billion in 2006 to $36 billion in 2010 added to that?
I think we ought to be most concerned about Pell Grants at the places that enroll large numbers of Pell Grant students. So at an institution that has a relatively small number of Pell-eligible students, it's going to be harder for them to raise prices to extract that money. Whereas at institutions that rely almost entirely on aid, then I think we have to be more concerned and think about the right way to balance access to those institutions with whether it's the best use of federal resources.
Ms. Conklin, the question for you on simplification, I think we moved up the FAFSA time periods now so you can fill them out earlier. So I get to do that and then my taxes right away. So the first of the year gets off to a rousing start in the Lewis household. But again, from a more global perspective or 30,000 feet, we've got a program in Minnesota that offers aid and higher ed you do on your tax return. In a perfect world, we're talking about simplifying, you're talking about a 3-tier. We're going to do tax reform here in FY18, we hope. Is there a way just to really simplify this down to a 1040?
There certainly is. What we've recommended in our technical panel, and it actually mimics what the College Board offered 10 years earlier, it's what Sue Dynarski has analyzed. Poor is poor, and assets aren't a factor for low-income students. And we only ask for that because we subsidize loans. If we didn't subsidize loans, we wouldn't need all of that income and all the asset data. So what we should only do is ask for the data we already give to the federal government. There's a Gates paper that you can, if you want to keep your subsidized loan program and you want to keep that information, you still just stick to what's already provided in the IRS tax forms with the schedules and basic adjusted gross income. Other than that, we are over-asking the same questions, and we're asking students to be financial managers. That's not reasonable.
So conceivably, you could do it on a 1040.
Absolutely. And we have recommended, if you have already qualified for a federal means-tested program across the federal government, why do you go through this process again to certify you're poor? You might already kind of be put to the front of the line as an eligible student.
I thank the panel, and I yield back.
Thank you for yielding. I now recognize Mr. Sablan for 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Davis, for having today's hearing, and welcome everyone. And as a regional co-sponsor of SAFRA, I also find this hearing today very timely. My district, the Northern Mariana Islands, we only have a small community college with a little more than 1,000 enrolled students. A large majority of the students come from low-income families. And Dr. Chinos, sir, over 90%, receive Pell Grants, so making it possible to pursue their higher education aspirations. And the minimum wage surged $6.55 an hour. And you cannot get on a car and drive across a county line to go to college elsewhere. It's going to be very expensive. So the president's recently released budget would cut $3.9 billion of the funding currently reserved for the Pell Grant program and leaves the program in unstable footing for future generations. And on top of that, the majority of this committee have also separately proposed to eliminate funding. As stated in their budget views and estimates for fiscal year 2018, their proposal will eliminate all of Pell's mandatory funding. And I strongly believe that the continuous success of people in my district, the Northern Marianas, and in our country, lies with our ability to train our citizens through higher education to be productive members of our society. And this money that the president and the majority are trying to take away from needy college students is necessary to ensure Congress can continuously modernize and strengthen the program to better support students. So instead of cutting or reducing student financial aid, we should be investing in this program. And so, Ms. Copeland Morgan, how can the Pell Grant program be strengthened and not weakened?
Thank you, Congressman. The program could be strengthened by increasing the maximum award. Pell Grant is only paying about 19%. The average award is only paying about 19% of costs for students. It can be strengthened by continuing to target the funds to the most neediest students. I will add that a lot of committee members have been concerned about institutional behavior. Incentivizing institutions who are enrolling and graduating Pell Grant students will help to change some of that behavior. So I encourage you to look at that. And year-round Pell is key to acceleration. It is costly for students to hang around our institutions for an additional year simply if they had a Pell to take those extra 3 to 9 units, they could be out in 4.1 years rather than 5 years. So I think you're hearing a theme here across all of the witnesses today that year-round Pell, along with prior year, have been good movements toward simplification.
And one more question, Ms. Morgan, if I may. I've increasingly heard from some of my colleagues on the majority that Congress should create programs that target middle-income students and not low-income students, because low-income students are already taken care of by grant aid. Is this what you see in your institution at your University of California and around the nation?
That has not been the case in the 40 years that I've been in higher education. 61% of Pell Grant recipients borrow to complete their degree, compared to about a little less than a quarter of non-Pell recipients. And so the federal investments in campus-based programs, for example, subsidized loan programs are very key for completion of these students. And I might add that at the University of California, again, we see four-year graduation rates are amongst the highest in the country, 76%, and six-year graduations, 92 to 93%. System-wide, 86%. The 92, 93 is at UCLA, and yet we are 40% first-generation college students, and most of our campuses are anywhere from 35 to 45% Pell-eligible students.
Well, thank you. Actually, and I'm very happy because my daughter graduated 2 years ago. My son's getting out in May, thank God, because people back home say that Congress, if you are a child of someone in Congress, then Congress pays for your child's education. I don't know where they hear that. I really think it's Fox News, because that's the only news we have. But that's unfortunately untrue. It's fake news, right? That's what it is.
Gentleman's time is
Thank you,
expired. I
Mr.
appreciate
Chairman.
that.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
And I'll now recognize Mr. Messer for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel. Obviously, very important issue today as we work through what we can do to improve federal student aid. And we've talked a lot about student borrowing. Many on the panel are probably well aware, but according to a recent Brookings Institute study, too many students just don't know how much they're borrowing. I think it's part of what contributes to the high dollars that students do borrow. According to the study, roughly 28% of students with federal loans said they had no federal loans at all, and 14% said they had no debt at all, even though they had student loans. Based on these statistics alone, it's clear that somewhere along the way we've failed to communicate to students how they're financing their education and what that means for their future. The Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008 required the Federal Reserve to reform the private student loan disclosure form and used consumer testing to improve it. As a result, today, we have a private student loan disclosure that gets down to brass tacks. It clearly and boldly discloses things like the total loan amount, the interest rate, total payments made over the life of the loan, and other disclosures that are essential for a student to know before they take out a loan. Contrast that, on the other hand, with the Federal Master Promissory Note, the MPN, I think it's technically called, which is used as the primary contract for all federal student loans. It's an 11-page fine print document that is incomprehensible unless you happen to specialize in higher ed finance. And Ms. Soucier, I was going to ask you, do you think consumer testing of the Federal Master Promissory Note paperwork and other disclosures like it would make those forms more useful to students?
Absolutely. I think we need not just more information out to the students, but we need it more often. They're required to get entrance loan counseling at the start of getting their loan. They're getting that loan at 17, 18 years old when they don't understand, they've never received any debt. They don't understand what they're reading. So what we need to do is we need to give it to them more often, and we need to be able to require it before they receive funding. For us, it would be every semester. Some schools, they may only need it every year. I think we need the flexibility based on our student population to require them to come in and get additional information, both in writing, in person, online, by videos, however we can get the information to them so they can understand what it is they're getting.
I'll give you a practical answer from Indiana University in my home state. They put together just essentially a letter of notice to students that every year in the fall went to each student at IU and disclosed what track they were on as far as student borrowing and what the cost of their education would be if they continued on the same track. And they saw that student borrowing went down as much as a quarter to a third just by simply every year sending a clear, readable letter that notified those students of what their debt path was. We're working on legislation that would make that national. It's already been a law in Indiana that now applies to every university, not just Indiana University, and we're hoping that we can take that national. Next question, in the limited time we have left to Ms. Coughlin. You mentioned in your testimony that you think aggregate federal student loan limits should be reduced and simplified. And you went on to imply that any void in lending created as a byproduct of that could be filled by private financing like income share agreements if the appropriate incentives are created to serve low asset individuals. There's a Purdue program that's been sort of cutting edge nationally on this. And could you explain some of the types of incentives that could encourage income share providers to serve low asset borrowers like Pell Grant students?
Thank you, Mr. Messer, for your question. One point of clarification, the proposal of this technical panel actually called for an increase in loan limits for undergraduates and graduates, just one set per, and those are an example of some of the savings in our simplification that we reinvested for students' benefit. But on the issue of income share agreements, it is a promising new private financing vehicle whereby an investor can identify students who are able to repay their loans based on a share, like 5% of their income. And if they're not able to make that income, they don't make those payments. So it's a pure income-based payment program. But it's going to create incentives with colleges to be able to make sure that they're focused on the returns and those labor market returns, which we heard was important to the committee earlier. It's going to cause students to need that information that we've been talking about is so important, about choosing programs carefully, about borrowing carefully, and about using your time well. And so it's going to bring, I think, more transparency. It's not in lieu of the loan programs we have, but particularly, I think, at the graduate level, there's just real promise.
Yeah, well, thank you. Income share agreements are not the answer for everybody, but I think they're the answer for more people than are currently being served by them now. hopefully we can make some headway on that issue in the coming weeks and months. I yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Takano for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, I'd like to say a few words on this idea that we can't increase financial aid because some people think that's what causes tuition increases, the so-called Bennett hypothesis. First, the best studies on this find that it's not the case at public and nonprofit colleges. However, we do have quality evidence showing that this does occur at for-profit schools, which strongly suggests that we need better oversight of this sector. But more importantly, we need to take a step back and reject the cynicism that implies, that this idea implies. By all means, let's look for ways to make tuition more affordable, but let's not throw up our hands and say that we shouldn't increase aid because of, I think, the misleading indications of this theory, the Bennett theory. Ms. Copeland Morgan, as I said, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe that financial aid, including Pell and federal loans, have driven the increase in tuition. In all your decades of experience working at various institutions, has this ever been the case?
Thank you, Congressman. It has not been in my experience. I know that there is a small amount of research that shows there may be a correlation between increases in aid in the for-profit sector. And I think simple oversight, greater oversight of that area where those schools are not graduating Pell recipients in low income. But I think you find partners in four-year higher education institutions, and I would encourage, therefore, greater investment, particularly, again, for those who are serving disproportionate numbers of low-income and Pell Grant recipients. That, I would say, also includes the campus-based programs, and we've not talked much about Perkins Loan today, which you know will come to an end this September. The federal government has not invested in Perkins loans for over a decade, and I would really encourage the committee to consider legislation that would allow institutions to continue to award under the Perkins Loan program, which is a better option than private loans for these low-income working families.
Thank you. Does institutional leadership make decisions based on these increases in aid?
Again, I think that bit of research is a distraction from the bigger issue of investing in our young people so that they can achieve their career goals. I've not sat around the table. That's not been my experience, and I think, as some of your members have mentioned, overwhelmingly, and you too in your opening comments, overwhelmingly public institutions and many of private institutions, the not-for-profit private institutions, are also investing their own dollars in financial aid programs. In the UC system, for example, a third of our tuition revenue goes right back into grant programs for low-income students, and so that's not been my experience.
What, in your estimation, does drive the cost of tuition, in a nutshell, quickly?
Well, if there is insufficient aid for students, certainly, again, at the University of California system, we put a third of our financial aid back into financial aid programs. I think the cost of technology, quite frankly, today, as someone who's gone through, no technology to the technology we see today is a big driver. I think the students are interested in multiple disciplines, and certain interdisciplinary education is more costly. And I think institutions are trying to find ways to deliver a quality education in a more cost-effective way. I know I spend probably 30% of my time in those kinds of conversations, and so that might be one area that the committee can spend more time talking about. How do you help institutions in that area to keep costs affordable so that we can serve more students and graduate our students earlier?
Mr. Chingo, you mentioned in your earlier testimony institutions that primarily rely on financial aid that seem to fall in the category of, are you referring to the for-profit college industry as one of those categories of institutions?
Sure. I mean, a lot of them.
Yeah, and increased federal aid does seem to be linked to increases in costs at those institutions. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, there's some evidence to indicate that's the case, as several folks have mentioned today.
Ms. Conlin, can you comment on year-round Pell Grants as far as how they might help students from the freshmen, before their freshman year in college and after their senior year, Do we know much about these summer bridge programs to increase preparedness to be ready for college level English or math?
Sorry, time has expired.
My time has expired.
Hopefully within some questions you'll be able to get an answer.
We'll submit
I
later
appreciate
for
it.
you.
That's a good question, but unfortunately your time's expired. I now recognize Mr. Smucker for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this hearing. I'm a father of 2 girls who are in college, so I've been through this process, and I must admit I was chair of the Education Committee in the Pennsylvania State Senate and served as one of the directors on FEA, the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency, and I still found it confusing. So I think it's overdue to simplify and create a more efficient system, so I look forward to being part of that discussion. Mr. Mester had asked questions in regards to student knowledge about the loans they've taken out, the provisions of those loans, and so on. I'd like to take that just a step further. I think one of the things that we don't do very well in our system of higher education is provide information to students about the earnings potential for a specific major, maybe the earnings potential for a specific major at a specific school. At the end of the day, you're taking out the student loan with the hopes of being able to pay that back. It's an investment, and so I don't think, from what I see, we do a very good job of educating students about their ability to repay. And I guess maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Chingo. I'd like to get your impression on that, and I'd like to ask whether there is, what your impression is of how we do on that, and whether there would be, if we're talking about reconfiguring our federal student aid system, would there be a way to tie in additional information in regards to the ability to pay back based on the major that a student is choosing?
Thank you for the question. I think it is critically important that students have better access to information on what they can expect down the road when they're deciding where to go to college, how much to pay, how much to borrow. And I think some progress has been made, right? A couple of years ago, we didn't know for the whole country average earnings for each college, and now we have that through the college scorecard. But we do need to go one step further and get that information down to the program level, which some states have done, but we don't have it at the national level yet. And then we can think about, as we're thinking about counseling around borrowing and repayment, finding ways to get that information to students. Because some research we're doing at the Urban Institute suggests that you can't just build it and they will come. You can't just put the information out there. You have to think about how to make it intelligible to students. How do they know what a $45,000 starting salary means for what they can expect to borrow? So there's progress to be made.
Do students currently get any of that information as a part of the application for assistance?
Not that I'm aware of.
Would there be a way to link those in some way?
I think through disclosures. I mean, this, one of my colleagues might be able to better address this doing the work on the ground, but I imagine there would be.
Anybody else care to address that?
I would just mention that in our career centers, we do provide this information. We do survey our graduates after they graduate 5 and 10 years out, and I think that that's probably an area that we can do more in. I agree. Certainly technology allows us to provide more links for students in that regard.
Mr. Smucker, Ms. Sousier works in a state, Texas, that is one of these states that has innovated in linking their labor market data with their post-secondary student data. So at the state level, they've demonstrated the leadership to create these metrics. The state makes them publicly available to students. And then community organizations, high school counselors, good bundle of technology applications can provide that information to students in a variety of ways. But the state's taken on the role to make that transparent. And that's an example of progress, I believe.
Thank you. I'm going to just shift gears. I have a minute. Ms. Sousier, your written testimony specifically mentioned the gainful employment regulation, how it can ultimately harm today's students. Just if in about 55 seconds, could you expand on that briefly?
I'd be happy to, thank you. No, my biggest concern, we spend a lot of time trying to comply and report the information being required. We've spent hours and hours with our technology groups doing that. And what my biggest concern is, our workforce office does a great job working with business and industry around Houston to create programs to get students trained into certain jobs. And my concern is if the data isn't fully accurate or doesn't fully represent the program, that it could label programs in jeopardy of being disbanded after they put so much effort into creating the programs.
I'd be interested in continuing that discussion with you at a later time. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Ms. Blunt Rochester, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I really want to thank this panel. This hearing was really interesting and exciting. Even if you don't think it's exciting to me. I come from the state of Delaware, and so I represent the entire state. And the issue of college affordability was talked about up and down the state, particularly as we talk about strengthening our economy that's connected to everything. And I particularly like the 5 crises, Dr. Chingo, that was pretty interesting to me. I think a potential crisis is cuts to these programs. That's another potential crisis. My question is directed to Ms. Copeland Morgan, and it's basically a recent report by the National Center for Education Statistics found that 1 in 5 undergraduate students surveyed in their study did not seek out any form of financial aid. When students were asked why, the majority of them cited misinformation. 44% thought that they were ineligible for aid, and another 43% thought that they could afford college without the help. This tells me that there's a lack of information on the part of students and families on how financial aid works and the true cost of going to college. How can Congress ensure more students are receiving the needed information to make informed choices post-high school?
Thank you for your question. I think early outreach is key. Investment in programs like TRIO and Gear Up, the funding of Perkins Loan, which we use those dollars also to administer loan programs, federal work study, we deploy students into communities to help get that word out about financial aid. So I mentioned those to say that the federal aid programs, particularly like work study, allows us to get that message out to those communities most in need. I think the simplification of the FAFSA, and when we simplify it, then put that information out that early, I call it baby college, that students would know from the time of birth that they are eligible, particularly the low-income students, again, where they've been through need-tested programs, or we use IRS data to understand what their income is. So it is a concern. I think probably many of you as first generation probably experienced this as well, but the investment in outreach programs are key. And right now, many of those programs are subject to cuts as well.
I follow up on that to say I, like many of my colleagues up here, have 2 children that went through the whole process with FAFSA, seen the changes, promissory notes, all of that, and myself participated in work study programs, and it's complicated for almost everyone. So to see the bipartisan conversation is a positive. So my second question is for you as well. As our country fully shifts from an industrial economy to a knowledge-based economy, higher education has increasingly become the surest way out of poverty. And you talked a lot already about the goal of coming out of poverty. And now more and more jobs are looking for workers that graduate with master's degrees and doctorate degrees, respectively, 22% and 20% increase in the number of those. We're hearing about proposals that would limit graduate students from accessing federal dollars. What can the federal government do to continue to provide access to capital for individuals wanting to pursue graduate degrees? I actually served as Secretary of Labor in my state, so I understand the correlation between education and jobs. And also I was pleased to hear the conversation about labor market information as well and connecting that to what we're doing at the university level. But can you talk a little bit about that, anyone on the panel? And we have 53 seconds.
I would just say historically grant programs have been targeted to undergraduates and less investment has been made at the federal level through the federal loan programs for graduates. And if we're going to meet the technological advances and the ingenuity that's needed for our society today, we have to provide financial and a financial investment, a pathway for students to continue their education so they can get those graduate degrees and become productive contributing members of our labor market in that regard.
Other members?
I think I want to echo what the chairman said earlier about simplification does not equate with cutting. In the perspective that I have and that this technical panel I represent here today has, we recommend, again, one set of annual and aggregate loan limits for graduate students, and they increase. And so you could borrow $90,000 through the federal program to support your graduate education and training, and that would be added to your undergraduate loans for a maximum of $125,000. So that would be the new umbrella that we're offering.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you for yielding back. I recognize the gentleman, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Sure. We mentioned the Pell Grants a little bit before, and maybe I'll direct this to Ms. Conklin, although anybody else can jump in if they want. I think the Pell Grant program or other programs have been subject to criticism for even when I was in college by the middle class. And people get tired of the American government hating the middle class, and they have to kick in for their kids' programs, or their kids have to take out loans. Well, maybe kids from some other families seem to get things for free. Do you think one way to deal with this problem would be to have, say, no Pell Grants in your freshman year, at least have for the freshman year, have the kids who aren't in the middle class take out loans like the kids in the middle class already have to, and that way you could make sure that everybody who's going to college after at least to get through the first year are more serious about college? You think that'd be a fair thing to do?
Carson, I think what you're asking is if there's a Robin Hood effect in higher education where middle class and upper middle class people are paying for poor people and who aren't ready for college. Am I understanding your question?
Well, just the unfairness, the resentment. I know in many ways in this country we hate the middle class. You know, we love the rich, we love the poor, we hate the middle class. People wonder why. Sometimes they use these Pell Grants too for goodies and electronics, and they resent the fact that by doing it right, their kids are penalized.
So I think that, you know, one thing that we struggle with is the Pell Grant is a tangible voucher, and it's a target. I grew up in California, went to a public college. Keeping tuition low in a state is the largest subsidy of middle-class students we have in the state of California. Keeping the University of California affordable and accessible is a very large middle-class subsidy. And so the middle class in California does have its public higher education heavily invested in. At the University of California at Berkeley, where I think one of our members is a graduate, exactly, the average family income is higher than Stanford. But tuition is heavily subsidized by public taxpayers. So I think the middle class angst is targeting a Pell Grant program, which has shown to be pretty effective at getting students to enroll, when really the hidden subsidy to middle class is we keep our public tuition low.
Well, I think that subsidy sometimes leads to excess academic staff, but I suppose it also, you could say benefits the students. Again, I'm going to come back though. Do you think it would be fair? I mean, then the tuition is low for everybody. Would it be fair, right now we have an unknown number of people who are getting Pell Grants who will not graduate. And I think to make sure that we're not wasting the money, it might not be a bad idea to have people, at least in the first year, take out loans rather than grants. And that was kind of my question, but we'll move on to the next question. I've received anecdotal evidence in my district of people not getting married. Because, of course, if you don't get married, it's easier to be in poverty and get Pell Grants. Would you care to comment on that? Anybody comment on that? I mean, I've heard it from several people. You're the experts.
I'd be happy to comment on that. There are decisions, people are making personal decisions based on financial aid eligibility. We know that. We know people who've gotten divorced because it would be more beneficial for their students to qualify for aid. Is that what you're asking?
Exactly. Isn't that horrible, the way our government just, like Karl Marx said, we just want to destroy the American family?
But again, it goes back to your comment about the middle income. Who do feel like they're not getting treated as well in terms of federal funding. So it goes back to that. If you have two middle-income families come together, they don't qualify for aid, but a single parent would in that same circumstance. So they're making that decision based on qualifying for eligibility.
It's clearly a flawed program. I'll give you just one more question, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. As I, tour my trade schools and see people want to become a carpenter's apprentice when they're 28 after they realize their college degree was a waste, or my tech schools and people go back and become welders when they're 33 after they found their college degree is a waste. Do we all agree that we have too many people going to college now? You all agree with that?
I think the definition of college, as I use it, is any education and training beyond high school. It's that air conditioning certificate program you're talking about. That's college to me.
Okay, we'll put it this way. Do we have too many people going to four-year college?
We are underproducing certificates in this country and sub-associate credentials.
Okay, so in other words, there'd be people better off.
We need to create really good pathways to those associates.
Can you just say it for me, though? We have too many people going to four-year college. Can you say it for me?
The time's expired. Your time has expired. I'd like to recognize Mr. DeSaulnier for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member, a proud graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, Ms. Davis, for this hearing. Can't think of many things that, for the long-term health of this country, is more important than figuring this out. Coming from the Bay Area, what I get from both researchers and people from the private sector is, as opposed to the last interchange, is more people who have bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees in a knowledge-based economy that requires people who can move and think and contribute to the innovation, certainly, that we get in the San Francisco Bay Area. But one of the challenges that strikes me, I'll keep the chorus of as a father of two kids who fortunately are out of college and are done with their student debt, but still struggle with kind of making the income that was available in my generation, is this perfect storm of access for kids who really work hard to all of your comments, particularly disadvantaged. So I was at Berkeley last week, and I've heard this over and over again. And Ms. Copeland Morgan, because you were in a high-cost area, or maybe Ms. Conlin, is the cost of housing, so, and the external costs. So a lot of these kids, and it's CSUs, I know in the East Bay, they're putting more capital improvements in our community college, in capital improvements that attract kids to go to school and stay. But at the CSUs, they're not providing dormitories and housing. So you get speculators in a high-cost area where the cost of housing is going up more and more. I have a bill that's getting some support from the other side to, and the dangers of overseeing this to make sure it's used right, but for kids who can't afford the housing costs to be at Berkeley or UCLA, are you seeing that? Because at least anecdotally, I'm getting that a lot from students, both at CSUs and at UCs, that they can afford the tuition, but if they had more flexibility through Pell Grants and financial aid, they could get cheaper housing off campus if they had access to financial aid for that.
Certainly, the cost of living in some states is exorbitant, even for non-students. Our focus is on helping students to make wise financial decisions, and again, acceleration of their time to degree through programs like the year-round Pell Grant program, through our Perkins loans and other kinds of things. And the institution is very involved with the community in trying to find housing, and that's for all of our campuses, affordable housing for students. Students are willing to do what they need to do to get their education, so it's not unusual that a student will have 4 roommates so they can keep borrowing down and be close to the institution or on our campuses so that they can manage the educational costs. I think students' primary goal is to be a student, to get their degrees and graduate. And I think, again, we've been talking about ways of simplifying the process, which is key. I'd love to see a 4-year award letter for low-income students because their income doesn't change over those 4 years. And I'd love to see a continuation of funding like the ACA for the campus-based programs so that we can continue to put more counselors on the ground to address the kinds of concerns that you've raised here today.
I've read articles about this with Clooney as well. So obviously in New York, it's a high-cost area. Ms. Conlin, do you have anything to? And it strikes me part of it, if you were going to give more flexibility for housing, the oversight to make sure it's done efficiently, effectively, and not abused would be a challenge.
So, Congressman, I'm not prepared to comment on those oversight issues with any expertise, but I will compliment you on this understanding you have that the total cost of attendance for particularly low and moderate income students in high-cost areas is a huge barrier to retention. And I can commend to you something that Lumina Foundation has created, that they're working with a number of university systems around the country on, and they call it Beyond Financial Aid. But it's the idea of how do you, starting at the federal level with your foundational single grant, single loan program, how do you then make sure that institutions and in their communities are accessing means-tested benefits, food banks that are local, shelters, that there's a set of resources that students, particularly non-traditional students, need to know about, and it's the responsibility of a community to come together to share those. And so I want to say that it's not just a Pell Grant paying for tuition that will make a difference in student success.
It resonates for me personally. When my dad lost his job when I was a freshman in college, I could put together the money for the tuition, but I couldn't for the room and board. It was easier to do it in Worcester, Massachusetts than in the Bay Area, Los Angeles today than it was in the 70s. But it's still, when I hear these kids who have done everything right, and they get accepted, they're 4Os, and they can't afford the cost of housing, and they live on sofas with other friends and then leave because they can't afford it. It just seems to be a striking example of how we need to be adaptable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, thank you, Jim. Yields back. And I have to correct the record earlier. I guess I said our ranking member was UCLA. She's California, but the Berkeley campus.
That's a big mistake.
Especially since they're playing Kentucky. I now recognize Mr. Courtney for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. It's a really thoughtful hearing today, and some good ideas in terms of moving forward, finally, with the reauthorization of the Higher Education Authorization Act. And, there is, if you drill down some of the testimony, you can actually find a few areas of overlap that's unexpected and helpful. And then, obviously, there's some issues that we really do have to make some decisions on. Dr. Chingos, I was pleased to see on page 6 of your testimony where you said that the student loan program should break even fiscally and not make profits off of students. This morning's 10-year Treasury notes, in other words, the amount of interest that the government is going to pay on a 10-year note is 2.44%. We're still in a place right now where the government is collecting legacy interest rates from 10 years ago, which far exceed 2.44%. And, that is and people obviously who don't have equity to refinance those loans, again, are really kind of helpless in terms of being able to take advantage of the low interest environment that's been, the reality of our economy for a number of years. The Bank on Students Emergency Loan Refinancing Act, which was introduced last year by myself and Senator Warren, would have actually given people an opportunity to refinance down. And CBO estimated that about $50 billion would be saved for borrowers who are still paying, again, some of these legacy loans. That would, I think, it wouldn't be loan forgiveness. It would not be discharge of the debt. It would just simply, I think, align this debt burden with other forms of consumer debt. And it will be introduced again in this Congress. And again, hopefully we can get strong support on that if a Higher Education Reauthorization Act is submitted. The other issue which I want to just touch on a little bit is the issue of public service loan forgiveness, which again, there is some disagreement between some of the testimony that's here today. Mrs. Copeland Morgan, you in your testimony expressed support for public service loan forgiveness. Just to take an example, the National Health Service Corps, which again is a very strong incentive to serve in underserved areas as an example. Maybe you could sort of talk about the benefits of that program from your experience.
Thank you, Congressman. I do disagree with my colleagues here about loan forgiveness for public service. I think it is a good thing. The examples that were mentioned that are concerns, I think, can be addressed within current legislation. But we need to find ways of encouraging young people to go into these large areas of needs within our states and within their communities. I think there is evidence that that those programs are working. And again, I think overall, when we hear about those areas where there are some small problems, we need to make sure that we don't allow those to be distractions to what is overall a solid program and a very small program in the large scale of what we're talking about here in higher education.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. The mental health bill, which we passed at the end of last Congress and was signed into law by President Obama, one provision in it was to actually extend to National Health Service Corps loan forgiveness to pediatric and adolescent psychiatry, which in the wake of Sandy Hook from Connecticut, it was a bitter lesson about the fact that this is one of the most critical areas of our healthcare system that is just, alarmingly understaffed across the country. And the problem is that the reimbursement, if you're a graduating medical student wanting to go into psychiatry, there's this disparity if you treat kids versus adults. And if we don't do something about it, we're going to see more of these problems, proliferate out there. And you talk to people in, preschool and K through 5. I mean, that is just, it is, again, a really alarming trend in terms of young kids, in terms of experiencing that. And again, it was great to see bipartisan support for that loan forgiveness effort to address something that, as a nation, we really have, I think, a moral duty to perform. And again, if there's fixes that are needed in the program, as you said, let's deal with that. Let's not just eliminate what I think has been a really healthy way to get underserved occupations as well as regions of the country critical public service jobs. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and that's the testimony for all members of the committee. We have from the full committee with us who's very interested in these issues. We work together on these in a very bipartisan way. Ms. Bonamici, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Guthrie and Ranking Member Davis, for holding this hearing and for allowing me to join your subcommittee today. This is an issue my constituents in Oregon care about a lot. I'm someone who worked my way through. I started at community college 2 years, and 2 years at University of Oregon, and then 3 years in law school. That makes me a double duck. And I did that all with a combination of loans, grants, and work study. And when I graduated, I went into public service, not to a private firm, but I still had little difficulty repaying my student debt. And that experience is less common today. As we know, more students are borrowing. They're borrowing larger amounts, and at the same time, there are millions of students who, many of whom were for some reason or another unable to complete their programs, and they're behind on their payments, or they're in default, which is causing an enormous drag on our economy. So we face a lot of challenges, and I hope that this committee will take a comprehensive approach to making higher education accessible and affordable. And I wanted to follow up on the comment that was made about better, more frequent information from our panelists. I'm pleased to partner with Chairman Guthrie on the Empowering Students Through Enhanced Financial Counseling Act, long title, but important piece of legislation that will help students with better information, more frequent information, and help them limit borrowing and plan ahead for repayment. So we have a pretty long list: strengthening Pell Grants, simplifying loan repayment and access, providing evidence-based supportive students to help with completion rates, especially for those first-generation students. We have some great model programs out in Oregon in that regard. Students who are parents, students with disabilities, students returning from the workforce, veteran students. So there's a long list. And I just want to also make a comment about the income-driven repayment discussion that I've heard here today. There are bipartisan efforts. I have the SIMPLE Act, that is a bipartisan piece of legislation to get more people into income-driven repayment and to keep them there. It's the annual recertification that can sometimes get people out. So we're working on that, again, in a bipartisan way, and that's an important piece as well. But I really wanted to talk about the Federal Work Study Program today. As someone who greatly benefited from it myself, I know that work study can give students valuable real-world experiences, reinforce what they're learning in the classroom. And the program requires a match from employers, so we see federal funding go further. So I was, needless to say, disappointed to see the president propose a budget that would significantly reduce federal work study investment. So, Mrs. Copeland Morgan, how can the federal government maintain flexibility in the work study program while also helping institutions connect more students with work-based learning opportunities that align with their interests and career goals? And I want to ask another question, too. Go ahead.
Certainly, thank you for the question, and let me just state for the record that I got into education being a federal work study student working in financial aid for 4 years as a student. The federal work study program is one way of bringing parity for internships, work experience, and other things. And it reduces the cost of students working. It retains them on campus because they're in generally the academic environment. Certainly more funding and work study, we'd love to see that. I think this is a bipartisan issue. We've seen that work study aids in retention. Certainly our community partners, which the Federal Work Study Program allows us to partner with community-based organizations to employ students to help do some of the work that you're talking about here today, outreach work, getting the word out about financial aid, job location development program helps. And I think the real issue is that we've got to make a greater investment in these programs that work, and federal work study is arguably one of the best, along with the Pell.
Thank you, and I'm glad you mentioned internships because we see that it's a real equity issue. Some of the affluent students can do a prestigious internship, but students of more modest means cannot, and that's a place where work study can help. Now, I know Representative Allen earlier asked a question about the formulas for allocating campus-based aid to institutions, and those formulas have changed very little since the 1970s, and that was a long time ago. Some of my colleagues probably weren't born back then. For the work study program, the majority of the funding is distributed to institutions based on how much they received decades ago. And I know Ms. Conlin explained our neediest students are often left out by this formula. So Mrs. Copeland Morgan, how can work study funding be allocated more equitably?
Let's get rid of the base guarantee in the campus-based program. We've been talking about this since I've been in the profession to make it more modern and reflect, distribute those dollars where those students, where the lowest and neediest students, lowest income and neediest students are. But we can't do that without making a greater investment in the program.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for allowing me to join you today.
Thank you for being here today. The gentlelady yields back, and I would like to, I see no other members present for questions, and I would like again to thank our witnesses for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee today. And I now recognize Ranking Member Davis for any closing remarks she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also thank you very much. I think it's been a good and strong discussion and a lot of contributions all the way around in terms of some of the things that we actually can change without hurting students and furthering their education. So that's really the bottom line for me. It's got to help rather than hurt. I also wanted to put into the record, Mr. Courtney had an article regarding mental health, and I wanted to place that. And I did hear some consensus, as a number of people mentioned, so it's a great first start, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly hope we can come back together and look at some of the details and some of the best practices so that we actually can do something that's going to make a difference. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that. And I just want to close with these comments. You know, we're looking at simple. How do we make it easier? How do we make it more simple? I mentioned I have a couple of children in college now going through those kind of programs. We need to make it simple, but we do need the accurate data. I think Ms. Copeland Morgan said we need to make sure we have the accurate data. I had somebody say the other day, what if we made it so simple for federals, but then the campuses that do campus-based aid have to have separate forms, and I think that might have been some of the testimony today. So but we do want to make it easier for people to use. We also, we want to, in the year-round Pell, I think something I'm very interested in was talked about. You know, it's just not to accelerate because if you had 2.5 years of college versus 3 or 4, it's cheaper, which that is. That's obviously true. But I worked in manufacturing before, and I saw a lot of people that needed to go back and were qualified and needed and wanted to go back and get secondary education. But when you're 18 to 22 and your parents are there for you, it's easier. When you're 30 and you are a parent and you got maybe 2 or 3 children, which example I know, just the idea that it's going to take me 4 years to get somewhere is very difficult for people to do. But if you can spell out, you know, some things we can look at in accreditation for life experiences, and you get somebody into that 2 to 2.5 year time frame, it's something that's doable, and we want to encourage that. So this has been very informative for me. I appreciate the ranking member and all the members and their attentiveness to their questions and the witnesses. And without objection, there being no further business, the committee will stand adjourned.